Okay, well, like Marcelo said, I'm going to be talking about a study that the Fire Protection Research Foundation did with NFPA, evaluating the impact of the NIST recommendations 10 years after the station and plus fire. Just a little bit about the foundation before I go on, since I know most of you aren't familiar. We are an independent charitable organization that conducts research. We were formed by NFPA in 1982 as a separate organization. Our focus is to facilitate credible research and disseminate results, which is why all our reports are published and freely available to the public. And our research funds come primarily from public and private consortia and industry, grants and government sources, as well as other sources like NFPA itself. The foundation really serves as a research affiliate of NFPA, and our mission is to plan, manage, and communicate research in support of the NFPA mission. And the NFPA mission is to make the world safer from fire and related hazards. All right, so just an overview of the project that we did. NIST approached NFPA and the foundation because they wanted to develop a methodology to evaluate the impact of recommendations from National Construction Safety Team investigation reports, of which the station was one of those investigation reports. So overall, the goal of this project was to develop a systematic method to evaluate the impact of these recommendations, using the station as a pilot study. So the thought was, in the future, they could use this method to, the method that was developed, and apply that to other investigation reports that they do, because they do have many out there. So there were 10 recommendations from the station report, and we basically, for analysis, we assigned them into two groups. The first group related to legislation adoption and enforcement recommendations, and those recommendations specifically called for changes in the rules and practices that define the local environments and fire department effectiveness. And then the second group of recommendations were around research, mostly on related phenomena and mitigation methods that eventually lead to, or could lead to, recommendations for changes in the rules and the codes and standards as well. So the general methodology that we use to evaluate the impact from these recommendations, excuse me, the first thing we did was to look and evaluate the changes to the model codes and standards after the incident. In the U.S., most of the states and municipalities adopt a model code and then make any related changes for that jurisdiction. So most of the changes start at the top level, which is the model codes and standards. So what we did is basically looked at all versions after the station nightclub that were issued after the station nightclub to examine that. And what we found is basically not all the recommendations were made in the edition right after the station nightclub. Sometimes they took a while. And in one case, in 2015, there are still recommendations going into the model codes and standards that relate back to the station nightclub in terms of crowd management requirements. The second thing we did was to evaluate the changes to local rules and practices to determine the impact of those legislation and adoption recommendations. What was done was NFPA initiated a survey of for nightclub safety. And basically the survey was targeted at fire departments that serve communities of 50,000 or more, and they related back to the recommendations that is developed. And then thirdly, which I'll be focusing on the first two steps basically today. The third one is what we did to evaluate all of the ongoing research is to, and published research, was actually do a literature review that relevant to the topics that were recommended in those group B or the research recommendations. And basically what we did is we just reviewed all of the relevant material published or issued after the station nightclub and then evaluated them in terms of quality and the topical relevance to the recommendation. So there were 10 recommendations, as I mentioned. I'm going to focus on 2 of them today in the interest of time. So the second one, which Russ actually mentioned a little bit earlier, was on sprinklers. So NIST recommends that model codes require sprinkler systems according to NFPA 13 and that state and local authorities adopt and aggressively enforce this provision for all new nightclubs regardless of size, so no matter what size they are. And then for existing nightclubs with an occupancy limit of greater than 100 people. So that would be a retroactive requirement. So this recommendation specifically relates to model code change as well as adoption and enforcement of the model codes after this change is made. So firstly, changes to the model codes. What happened? The model codes that we considered for this recommendation were the NFPA model codes, as well as those published by the International Code Council. So the 2006 version of NFPA model codes change requirements to match the NCST requirements basically exactly. So the requirements for sprinklers to be installed in all new nightclub type occupancies, and then a requirement for sprinklers to be installed in existing nightclub like assemblies with occupant loads greater than 100. Prior to that, NFPA, and basically the 2003 edition of NFPA model codes required sprinklers in new assembly occupancies with loads greater than 300 and did not have any specific requirement for existing nightclub occupancies. So also in the 2006 editions of the International Building Code and the International Fire Code, there were requirements changed as well regarding sprinklers in Group A2 occupancies, which include assembly occupancies intended for food and or drink consumption. There is no specific nightclub definition in any of the model codes. So what they did is they changed the sprinklers were required where one of the following conditions exists, and this is for new nightclubs. Where the fire area exceeds 5,000 square feet, the fire area has an occupant load of 100 or more, or the fire area is located on the floor other than the level of exit discharge. This is if any of these are present. Previously, in the 2003 edition of the IBC and IFC, it required it for the same conditions except if it was an occupant load of 300 or more, so they reduced that occupant load. So the IBC covers existing structures in Chapter 34, and that details the requirements for alterations, repairs, additions, changes of occupancies for existing structures. And that evaluation process is based on requirements for new construction. However, this isn't a retroactive requirement. It's only required when there's a renovation or a change to a facility. So now those are the changes in the model codes and standards. Now, what happened on the local level? Well, what we found from the survey, or what we asked for in the survey, basically was we wanted to find out about the adoption of the requirements. So what's adopted? What addition is adopted? We wanted to figure out what the compliance was. How are those requirements enforced? What are you doing? What inspections are you doing? And then importantly from this is the timing of those changes in the requirements. I mean, if they were done after the station nightclub fire, because then they could relate back to the NIST recommendations. So the survey that was implemented included 3 specific questions regarding the sprinkler recommendation from NIST. The first was, are sprinklers required in nightclubs in your community? And then if they answered yes, did your sprinkler requirements change after the station nightclub fire in 2003? The second, do you conduct inspections just to check compliance with sprinkler requirements? And the third was, how many nightclubs do you think are in compliance with your sprinkler requirements? So the findings from that survey. What we found is in 80% of communities, and this is for communities all with that are serving 50,000 people or more. So 80% of communities have sprinkler requirements in place consistent with the NIST recommendations for existing nightclubs. And then it's likely that over 90% have sprinkler requirements in place that are consistent with the NIST recommendations for newly constructed nightclubs. In 81% of those communities, they estimate that all or most nightclubs are in compliance with their local requirements. And then importantly for NIST, half of those communities with at least 50,000 people and with sprinkler requirements report that their requirements changed after 2003, which was the year of the station nightclub fire. So they really shows that there's a clear link between that NIST recommendation and local changes. So the second recommendation that I'm going to talk about our findings about today was about model code adoption and enforcement. So what NIST specifically recommended was that all state and local jurisdictions adopt a building and fire code covering nightclubs based on one of the national model codes and update local codes as the model codes are revised. Implement aggressive and effective fire inspection and enforcement programs, and ensure that enough fire inspectors and building plan examiners are on staff to do the job and that they are professionally qualified to a national standard. So how did we evaluate this? Well, these are the 5 survey questions that related back to this specific recommendation. How many nightclubs are in your community? What code applies to newly constructed nightclubs in your community? What code applies to existing nightclubs in your community? Are there any local amendments or other requirements applicable to nightclubs? And for that, the answer to that question specifically were yes, changed after 2003, and no, not changed after 2003, and that's specifically to evaluate the timeline of any local changes. And then how are inspections used for enforcement? So what we found, over 90% of departments said they have local codes based on national model codes for both new and existing nightclubs. But we also found that up to 12% of departments fall short of the recommendation for newly constructed nightclubs because they're using an older edition of the code. So basically dating before the changes from the station nightclub fire took place. So basically 2003 or before. In addition, there was a large share of departments that appeared to fall short of the recommendation for existing nightclubs because they adopted the IFC, which had not adopted the recommended sprinkler requirements, retroactive sprinkler requirements for existing nightclubs. They did for the new. And then 100% of the departments report having some inspections for newly constructed and/or existing nightclubs. One thing to note here is that other studies have indicated that the situation is very different for smaller communities, which were not included in this nightclub survey. So this was 50,000 and bigger. What we basically recommended to NIST for future evaluations of this type. One of our major suggestions was the evaluation of this type needed to be performed more than once. And the reason for that is because it takes time for major changes to be implemented in the model codes and standards. It sometimes takes several cycles. In the US, the cycle is usually about 3 years. And then it takes even more time for that updated model code and standard to be implemented or adopted at the local level, state and local level. In addition, since we also looked at research recommendations, it takes even more time to conduct research and then for that research to make a change into the model codes and standards as well. So that's why we say that even 10 years seems like a long time. It really isn't when you're talking about the way that the building code cycles go and how long it takes sometimes for these changes to occur. And then, as I mentioned previously a little bit about the smaller communities, they are of interest because previous studies have indicated an enforcement in those communities are a contrast to larger communities. So we suggested for future evaluations to set an evaluation plan separately for large communities, medium-sized communities, and then smaller communities. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the statistics related about fires in eating or drinking establishments as well as sprinkler or extinguishing system installations. The data shown here and on the following slides I'm talking about here is based on data from the U.S. National Fire Incident Reporting System, or NFIRS. The current version of NFIRS does not have specific data for nightclubs. They're grouped in with eating or drinking establishments, along with restaurants and bars. So that's why all this data is for eating or drinking establishments. This chart specifically is from a 2012 report issued by NFPA on structure fires in eating and drinking establishments. And these fires have followed a significant downward trend from 1980 to the late 1990s. Since then, they have followed a slight but a bit inconsistent downward trend. This graph, or these numbers show the presence of automatic extinguishing systems in eating or drinking establishments in the U.S. This includes sprinklers as well as other systems, which would be dry chemical systems. And this is from John Hall's 2013 report, The U.S. Experience with Sprinklers, which showed the number of structure fires in eating or drinking establishment with any AES equipment present. In the first half of the 80s is 16%. In the second half in the 90s, up to 29%. And then the latest data, 2007 to 2011, is 63%. Impact on fire deaths in the U.S., and this is specifically for public assembly. The estimated reduction in civilian deaths per 1,000 fires associated with wet pipe sprinklers that are installed in public assembly buildings. It's remained steady at 100% reduction between unprotected properties to sprinkler protected properties from 1989 to the present data. Basically, that means that no one has died in a sprinkler protected public assembly occupancy in the U.S. in this time period. And then just to go into property damage or sprinkler impact on property damage in eating or drinking establishments. So this shows the estimated reduction in average property damage per fire. And this is associated with wet pipe sprinklers in these occupancies. So 1989 to 1998, 66% reduction. In the early 2000s, 59% reduction. There was a change in the data here too, as well, so that might be why there's a bit of a blip here. And then 2003 to 2007, 71% reduction in property damage. And then the latest data, 2007 to 2011, 75% reduction in property damage for eating or drinking establishments. So just wrapping up, I just want to acknowledge my co-authors for this work. John Hall and Michael Carter are both retired now from NFPA, but were with NFPA at the time of the study. And Matt Yin, the foundation intern, did a lot of work with me on the literature review. And then on Cygnus for funding the study through the grant program. And then lastly, also CBSpk for inviting me here to speak.